everybody. Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States, about smack dab in the middle of Chapter 4. Hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, you know what to do. Let's dig in. Redskins. Indigenous people continued to resist by burning settlements and killing and capturing settlers. As an incentive to recruit fighters, colonial authorities introduced a program of scalp hunting that became a permanent and long-lasting element of settler warfare against indigenous nations. During the Pequot War, Connecticut and Massachusetts colonial officials had offered bounties initially for the heads of murdered indigenous people and later for only their scalps, which were more portable in large numbers. But scalp hunting became routine only in the mid-1670s, following an incident on the northern frontier of the Massachusetts colony. The practice began in earnest in 1697 when settler Hannah Dustin, having murdered 10 of her Abenaki captors in a nighttime escape, presented their 10 scalps to the Massachusetts General Assembly and was rewarded with bounties for 2 men, 2 women, and 6 children. Dustin soon became a folk hero among New England settlers. Scalp hunting became a lucrative commercial practice. The settler authorities had hit upon a way to encourage settlers to take off on their own or with a few others to gather scalps at random for the reward money. Where else but America, huh? Let's go off and kill a few people and make a few bucks. In the process, John Grenier points out, they established the large-scale privatization of war within American frontier communities. Although the colonial government in time raised the bounty... Although the colonial government in time raised the bounty for adult male scalps, lowered that for adult females, and eliminated that for indigenous children under 10, how generous, the age and gender of victims were not easily distinguished by their scalps, nor checked carefully. What is more, the scalp hunter could take the children captive and sell them into slavery. These practices erased any remaining distinction between indigenous combatants and non-combatants and introduced a market for indigenous slaves. Bounties for indigenous scalps were honored even in absence of war. Scalps and indigenous children became means of exchange, currency, and this development may even have created a black market. Scalp hunting was not only a profitable privatized enterprise, but also a means to eradicate or subjugate the indigenous population of the Anglo-American Atlantic seaboard. The settlers gave a name to the mutilated and bloody corpses they left in the wake of scalp hunts: Redskins. This way of war, forged in the first century of colonization, destroying indigenous villages and fields, killing civilians, ranging, and scalp hunting, became the basis for the wars against the indigenous across the continent into the late 19th century. Colonial expansion. Having cleared the indigenous populations from much of the coastal region from New England to the Carolinas, Another wave of settlers employed the same kind of warfare in establishing the colony of Georgia, beginning in 1732. Technically, it was the part of Spanish-occupied Florida called Guale. From this time, the first settlers squatted on indigenous land in Georgia. Rangers were in the forefront of ethnic cleansing, clearing the region for British settlement. Brigadier General James Oglethorpe, commander-in-chief of the Georgia colony, tried but failed to turn his own small regular army into Rangers. So he commissioned Hugh Mackay Jr. to organize the regulars into a Highland Ranger force. A settler agent for the Georgia colony, Mackay was a former British Army officer and a Scots Highlander. The Highlanders were reputed to be tough, fearless fighters. In other words, brutal killers. It was unusual at the time to put a local militia officer in command of army regulars. The indigenous population of Georgia consisted primarily of the Cherokee Nation. The colonizers realized it would be impossible to persuade the Cherokees to accept or defend Georgia's settlers if war broke out between Britain and Spain over British encroachment into Spanish Guale. Traders from South Carolina had already brought smallpox and rum to the Cherokees, which had killed many in their villages and made them suspicious of all English people. Oglethorpe himself visited Cherokee towns but was rebuffed. Meanwhile, Spanish agents were also trying to win over the Cherokees to fight on their side against the British. In the fall of 1739, on the verge of war, Oglethorpe won commitment from some Cherokee villages in exchange for corn. But he was aware that, like other indigenous nations, the Cherokees would likely play one colonial power against the other for their own interests and could change sides at any moment. In December, English invasion farther into Spanish territory began. Anglo and Scots Rangers and their indigenous allies destroyed Spanish plantations and intimidated the Maroon communities in northern Florida, composed of local indigenous families and escaped African slaves from the British colonies, which I did think were primarily on islands. The Rangers sacked and looted, burned and pillaged, while hunting scalps of Spanish-allied indigenous people and runaway slaves. Lasting nearly a month, the operations ravaged Florida, in part because the Spanish put up little fight. During the 1740s, the British War Office and Parliament commissioned 2 companies of colonial rangers and authorized more than 100 men for full-time duty in the Highland Rangers in Georgia. Ranging, looting, and scalp hunting continued. War that turns the tide. The decade leading up to the outbreak of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 63, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, saw conflict on the British-French frontiers in New England, New York, and Nova Scotia, all of which were well populated with indigenous villages of various nations, as well as French settlers called Acadians. A clash of interest among British settlers, indigenous communities, and Acadians in the region of the present-day Canadian maritime provinces led to a 4-year conflict that the British called King George's War. Although Britain had gained nominal possessions of Nova Scotia, it could not control the population of Acadians and the mixed communities of intermarried Acadians and Micmac and Malecet people. the Acadian indigenous villages insisted on neutrality in the British and French disputes, and the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy supported them in that stance. But British imperialists wanted the land, and they permitted Anglo-American settlers to play a prominent role in the fighting, which included ranging and scalp hunting. By the end of the war, settler rangers dominated the British military presence in Nova Scotia, setting off sustained Acadian indigenous resistance against British rule. At the outbreak of the French and Indian War, while the British regular army and navy focused on French imperial positions in the Maritimes, the settler militia forces continued ranging against the Acadian indigenous villages, which led to an expulsion of the Acadians, sometimes known today as the Great Upheaval. In a period of weeks, British Army forces and colonial militias forced 4,000 non-combatants out of Nova Scotia, and at least half that number died in the Acadian diaspora. Some 8,000 escaped deportation by fleeing into the woods. The Acadians thus became the largest population of European settlers in North American history to be forcibly dispersed. This feat was accomplished with slaughter, intimidation, and plunder. By this time, there was no hesitation on the part of Anglo settlers to consider unarmed civilians of all ages as appropriate targets of violence. Major General Jeffrey Amherst, after whom Amherst, Massachusetts is named, commanded the British Army in the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. Allergies. In 1759, Amherst appointed Major Robert Rogers, the seasoned leader of New England's Rogers Rangers and perhaps the most famous and admired ranger in frontier lore, to lead a force of settler rangers, British volunteers, and allied Stockbridge indigenous scouts, all to be handpicked by Rogers. Amherst ordered them to attack a resistant Abenaki village in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Although Amherst ordered Rogers not to allow torture or killing of women and children, the commander would have known about these rangers' reputation of sparing no one in their blood-drenched raids on indigenous villages. In commissioning Rogers, Amherst effectively sanctioned settler ranger counterinsurgent warfare. In general, the British military not only tolerated but made use of the settlers' dirty war in the Cherokee War, the subsequent French and Indian War, and in the effort to crush Pontiac's Rebellion of 1763, in which Amherst is best known for his support of using germ warfare against indigenous people. Could it not be contrived, Amherst wrote to a subordinate officer, to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? We must, on this occasion, use every stratagem in our power to reduce them. The colonel promised to do his best. Amherst then gave orders to bring them, Pontiac's forces and allies, to a proper subjection until there was not an Indian settlement within 1,000 miles of our country. In the southern part of the French and Indian War, the British in 1760 found their war-making capacity overwhelmed by the Cherokee Nation. So here too they turned to rangers. In the spring, when the Cherokee Nation challenged British authority, Amherst rushed regular regiments to Charleston under the command of Colonel Archibald Montgomery, with orders to punish the Cherokees as quickly as possible so the soldiers could return north and join in the imminent attack on Montreal. In previous wars against indigenous nations, British commanders had assigned ranger groups specific missions, but in the Cherokee War, the British military forces, including regulars, would target non-combatants. A few months earlier, the North Carolina governor had conjured the strategy that would be used. In case a war must be proclaimed, the three southern provinces of Virginia and the Carolinas should exert their whole force, enter into and destroy all the Cherokee towns of those at war with us, and make as many of them as we should take their wives and children slaves, by sending them to the islands, West Indies, if above 10 years old, and to allow 10 pounds sterling for every prisoner taken and delivered in each province. This was the plan adopted. Commander Montgomery was well aware that even with irregular warfare and military Commander Montgomery was well aware that even with irregular warfare, the military could not defeat the Cherokees in their own country, and that he would need settlers and indigenous allies serving as scouts and guides. He added to his troop strength 300 settler rangers, 40 local militia members, and 50 Catawba allies. The Cherokee Nation had not succeeded in forming a confederation with the Muskogees or Chickasaws, so their villages were vulnerable. The first target was the autonomous Cherokee town of Estato, comprising some 200 homes and 2,000 people. Montgomery's forces set all the homes and buildings afire, picking off individuals who tried to flee while others who hid inside were burned alive. One after another, towns were set ablaze until the Cherokees organized a resistance strong enough to drive out the attackers. The British claimed to have crushed Cherokee resistance, but they had not, and the Cherokees laid siege to British forts. A year later, British forces struck again, this time even harder, and overwhelmed the Cherokees in their capital of Etcho and destroyed it. The British then moved on to the other Cherokee towns, burning them too. During the month-long one-sided Battle of Annihilation, the British razed 15 towns and burned 1,400 acres of corn. 5,000 Cherokees were made homeless refugees, and the number of deaths remained uncounted. Another weapon of war was alcohol, accelerating in the 18th century. In 1754, a Catawba leader known as King Hagler by English colonists petitioned the North Carolina authorities, "Brothers, here is one thing you yourselves are to blame very much in. That is, you rot your grain in tubs out of which you take and make strong spirits. You sell it to our young men and give it to them many times. They get very drunk with it, and this is the very cause that they oftentimes commit those crimes that is offensive to you and us, and all through the effect of that drink. It is also very bad for our people, for it rots their guts and causes our men to get very sick, and many of our people has lately died by the effects of that strong drink. And I heartily wish you would do something to prevent your people from daring to sell or give them any of that strong drink, upon any consideration whatever, for that will be a great means of our being free from being accused of those crimes that is committed by our young men, and will prevent many of the abuses that is done by them through the effect of that strong drink." King Hagler continued to petition for years for an embargo on liquor without succeeding. Britain's victory at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763 led to English domination of world trade, sea power, and colonial holdings for a century and a half. In the Treaty of Paris, 1763, France ceded Canada and all claims east of the Mississippi to Britain. In the course of the war, Anglo settlers had gained strength in numbers and security in relation to indigenous peoples just outside the British-occupied colonies. Even their significant numbers of settlers had squatted on indigenous lands beyond the colony's putative boundaries, reaching into the Ohio Valley region. To the settlers' dismay, soon after the Treaty of Paris was signed, King George III issued a proclamation that prohibited British settlement west of the Allegheny-Appalachian Mountain Barrier, ordering those who had settled there to relinquish their claims and move back east of the line. However, British authorities did not commit enough troops to the frontier to enforce the edict effectively. As a result, thousands more settlers poured over the mountains and squatted on indigenous lands. Really? By the early 1770s, terror against indigenous people on the part of Anglo settlers increased in all the colonies, and speculation in western lands was rampant. In the southern colonies especially, farmers who had lost their land in competition with larger, more efficient, slave-worked plantations rushed for western land. These settler farmers thus set as grenadier rights a prefigurative pattern of U.S. annexation and colonization of indigenous nations across the continent for the following century. A vanguard of farmer settlers led by seasoned Indian fighters calling on authorities, militias of the British colonies first, and the U.S. government army later, to defend their settlements, forming the core dynamic of U.S. democracy. The French and Indian War would later be seen as the trigger for independence of the settler population, in which the distinctly American nation was born. This mythology was expressed in the 1826 novel The Last of the Mohicans, a narrative of 1757 in which the author, land speculator James Fenimore Cooper, created a usable settler colonial history. Blockbuster Hollywood adaptations of the book in 1932 and 1992 reinforced the mythology, but the 1940 film, based on the best-selling novel Northwest Passage, which is considered a classic and remains popular due to repeated television showings, goes even further in portraying the bloodthirsty mercenaries, Rogers Rangers, as heroes for their annihilation of a village of Abenakis. I think we're going to have to call the episode to a close. I hope you enjoyed it. Hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the notification bell, because YouTube has been known to subscribe people who listen to stuff like this. And that way you get notified when I make a new video. Till next time.